of Southeast European Studies at Oxford and the wonderful panelists today with us, we would like to welcome you on this discussion on elections in the Western Balkans with a very good title, Can Elections Bring Real Change in the Region? This is part of a CSOC's seminar series on the quality of democracy in Southeast Europe. I'm Othon Anastasakis and I'm the director of Southeast Europe in Oxford. And I'm delighted to be co-convening this kind of seminar series and today to present to you this excellent panel. This is a seminar series which deals with the quality of democracy in the region in terms of looking at particular aspects and themes of democratic or illiberal politics, whatever you want to and choose to say. We're looking at media, for instance, rule of law, elections, political parties, transitional justice, and so on and so forth. For today, we've got this excellent panel. My only purpose here is to present Tena Prelec, who's the chair of this session. And Tena is currently with us in Oxford, a research fellow at the Department of Politics and International Relations. She works on anti-corruption, money laundering, and those issues, this particular project in Oxford now. But Tena has also a long experience and expertise and has worked on different universities as well. One of the Balkan stars, I call her, in the scholarly community. So with this, I will hide behind the CSOC's logo, and I will ask Tena to present today's talk and also the panelists. Thank you all very much for joining, and especially to the panelists for coming to this wonderful panel.
Thank you very much, Othon, for this far too generous introduction. Welcome to the distinguished audience to this event, provocatively titled, Can Elections Bring Real Change? So when we were planning this event, we thought that this question would be applicable to many different geographies, including perhaps even the UK. But to Southeast Europe, arguably, it is a particularly valid question. For people who study and who live in Southeastern Europe, there is this widespread frustration that things never get to really change fundamentally, and that elections are there very often just to legitimize the status quo. To a certain extent, this feeling was actually confirmed last year in 2020 when Freedom House, the very famous US think tank, downgraded Serbia and Montenegro from semi-consolidated democracies to hybrid regimes. According to their definition of hybrid regimes, these are electoral democracies that meet only minimum standards for the selection of national leaders. And therefore, the potential for sustainable and liberal democracy is unclear. However, recent events have challenged seemingly this notion that elections are there just as a window dressing to democracy and that they don't really bring a lot of change. We've seen, for instance, in August last year that in Montenegro, the parliamentary elections have meant seemingly the end of the 30 years long rule by Milo Đukanović so far. We've seen other outcomes in Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina at parliamentary and municipal elections, respectively, that have also somehow challenged this notion that everything is there to stay. So this poses another question also. Even when things seemingly change, how long lasting will this change be? And how deep-seated it is? And if this change ends up being disappointing, will the backlash be even stronger? I'm really pleased that today with me there is a stellar lineup of panelists who will help me help us unpack all these questions. And I'm particularly happy that we will be able to bring you both a very timely research and academic perspective, as well as a perspective from the field. So we have here with us in alphabetical order Professor Florian Bieber, who's a professor of Southeast European Studies at Graz University. We have Donika Emini, the executive director of Civikos platform, joining us from Pristina. We have Borisa Falatar, who's a former candidate in Bosnia and Herzegovina with Nasha Stranka, and currently he heads the OSCE's office in Kiev, joining us from Ukraine. We have Vujo Ilic, who's policy and research advisor at CRTA, joining us from Belgrade. And last but not least, we have Jovana Marovic, the executive director of the Politikon network in Montenegro, joining us from lovely Kotor. Some housekeeping notes. So as we have many panelists today, we will not be accepting questions from the audience. We will not have interventions from the audience, but we invite you to write your questions in the Q&A section. You can start writing them immediately, and I will do my best to do justice to them, to ask them on your behalf during the Q&A session. Before I hand over to the speakers, let me also tell you that today we're also presenting a paper by the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group. And for full transparency, I had something to do with this paper, so I'm not completely unbiased. But I will stick to chairing today, and I will pass the word to my wonderful colleague Jovana Marovic, who's the co-author of this brief. The brief is based on a large-scale survey promoted by the European Fund for the Balkans that was fielded in autumn 2020 and carried out by Ipsos, and was conducted on a nationally representative sample of citizens in all 6 Western Balkan countries, consisting of a minimum of 1,000 respondents. Without further ado, Jovana, aside from introducing us the main finding from the brief, could you tell us, so there has been some momentous changes in your country. What has the reaction of the citizens been to this change? Jovana, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Tena. First of all, to answer the question from the title, can the elections bring the real change? From the last year's events, we can see that there is a change, but we still have to wait from the process of the democratization to see whether this change is real or whether just one political elite is switched with another one. So let's start with the fact that the elections are usually not seen as the most powerful tool for change in the Western Balkans. This is because there is low trust in the work of institutions in the Western Balkans. There are poor conditions for free and fair elections. Usually people do not believe that the government can be changed through the elections, and that's because we have a collective action problem in the Western Balkans, meaning that usually under such conditions, citizens are opting not to challenge the governments and political elites in power, basically staying and keeping the status quo in the Western Balkans. But after we have all of this in mind when we started this public opinion survey in BIEPAC, when starting to define questions for citizens, trying to see what are the real changes after some major changes at the political stage in the Western Balkans. As you said, the biggest one was the one in Montenegro, when after 30 years, now we have different government without the, I almost said the ruling DPS. It's not the ruling anymore. It's now opposition party in Montenegro, which is something unimaginable just was in 2 months, just 2 months ago. So what happened in Montenegro? For the first time, opposition was able to group themselves in 3 rows. Like many opposition parties, small and biggest coalition and everything, they were able for the first time to group themselves in 3 rows, and in that sense, in that manner, preventing spillover of the votes to the ruling, at that time, ruling DPS. The second thing was that the opposition was able to mobilize citizens to vote for them. And there was the high turnout, 76%, despite the coronavirus crisis and everything. But the coronavirus crisis influenced and prevented the greater votes from the diaspora, which is traditionally voting for the DPS. Then the fourth factor was that that great dissatisfaction, which is still present in the country because of the widespread corruption, organized crime, clientelism, and many other issues. As you said, Montenegro is also a hybrid regime, even though it is usually called as a front runner of the European integration process. And then the let's say really important factor was the dissatisfaction because of the law on freedom of religion protests, which lasted almost the whole year, and the influence and the active role of the Serbian Orthodox Church in the country. So for the first time in Montenegro, we had, let's say, even playing field. OSCE again recorded the institutional advantage of the DPS, but the Serbian Orthodox Church helped one of the opposition blocs, Democratic Front, and they used mechanisms usually used by the DPS. Some of the mechanisms, let's say, door-to-door campaign. So these are all the factors which influence such outcome and victory of the opposition in Montenegro. But what is the most important thing, that we had this high turnout in Montenegro of the 76%, and now the people in Montenegro believe that actually government can be changed through elections. So the public opinion poll survey and results of the survey show that the now 80% of the Montenegrins believe that the government can be changed through elections. If this is happening in the country with the same government for 30 years, you can imagine that something similar can happen also in the rest of the Western Balkans, especially, for example, in Bosnia, and after the changes at the municipal level, which also were seen in last November. And this percentage is really trust in the electoral process, and trust that the government can be changed through elections is really higher in Montenegro than in the rest of the Western Balkans. Let's say that such opinion and support is 43% in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia, and then 38% in Albania, and then 56 in Kosovo, and North Macedonia 46. This higher percentage in North Macedonia and Kosovo is because they also experienced the recently change of the governments, and Kosovo is doing that more recently than the rest of the Western Balkans, let's say, in that way. Such, let's say, low confidence in elections, it's because of this great obstacles to the election process in the Western Balkans, and one of the most important one is the pressure on voters. Citizens have a fear that they will lose some benefits because of not voting for the ruling party, and some of the benefits are employment in public administration, then one-off support, social benefits, and lots of other let's say, benefits which are offered by the ruling party for voting for them. And despite this majority of citizens believing that there are pressure on voters, many of them, a vast majority of them, actually said that they never experienced the election-related pressure when it comes to Western Balkans in all countries, let's say, in that way. Then the second thing is because of all of the conditions which are influencing the election process in the Western Balkans, opposition is more often using boycott as the instrument, as tool to show their dissatisfaction. But there is no wide support for the boycotts in the Western Balkans, because around 50% of the citizens do not believe that the boycott is really a successful instrument to influence the processes and democratization, and to make pressure on the ruling party during the campaign and during the elections. Also, there is a belief that the opposition is not well organized, and this harshest, let's say, assessment is one from Serbia, where 84% do not believe, they believe actually that the boycott is not good, that the opposition is not well organized. And this should be connected with the, let's say, failure from last year's elections, and that the boycott is now not having any kind of results after almost half a year. Then to conclude this short presentation of the results of the public opinion survey, the last thing is whether the diaspora vote can influence the election outcome, and there is opinion, and the highest percentages in Montenegro that the greater number of voters from diaspora can influence the results of the elections. It is 75% of the citizens in Montenegro that do believe that the diaspora can change the things, and it is around, it's 63% in Kosovo that do believe in the same things. But when you ask people, it is also a high percentage of voters and citizens who believe that the diaspora voting is not well organized and well regulated. And when you're asking them why is such thing, or why is the diaspora voting well regulated, 36% in Kosovo said that the diaspora voting is well organized because they have right to vote at all. So there is a lack of knowledge among citizens about the diaspora voting and how it is regulated, because this topic is not that much present in public discourse. And that's why we think that this topic is really even more relevant for election reform and for free and fair elections in the Western Balkans. So this is it in short about the results of the public opinion poll. Of course, I can present more if the public if the attendees are interested.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jovana, for this very effective presentation of the results of the policy brief. It's really striking indeed what you mentioned, that that percentage of 80% of citizens in Montenegro that believe in change through elections now, if you compare it to that about 50% in some countries, even less than 50% in belief in change through elections of the other countries. And it's really striking that that happened in those less than perfect conditions, as you mentioned. And you mentioned this link, very strong link between the difficulty of elections as bringing about change and corruption. So I will turn to the next panelist now, Vujo Ilic from the organization CRTA that deals with election monitoring, to ask him this question, to ask him to unpack for us this connection between the electoral process and corruption and state capture. Vujo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tena, and thank you for the invitation to speak here today. So let me start by a quotation. So the quote is, "A change of the ruling class is of course not enough in itself. If the old majority is replaced by a new one continuing the same practices, this can have perverse consequences, potentially even spearheading another period of authoritarian rule." So Tena and Jovana will recognize this because this is the quotation from the conclusion of their policy brief that I just had the chance to read. And I can agree with this point of view. I think it's more than just a caveat for their conclusions. I think it fundamentally answers this great question that we are trying to answer today. Can elections bring real change? I think basically that elections are necessary for change, but insufficient for real change. And I'll just try to unpack that and give a couple of thoughts and illustrate it with the case that I know best, which is Serbia. So the reason why we are asking this question is basically because we have been seeing the democratic backsliding in the region, mostly following the 2008 economic crisis. It's not been only the Western Balkans, it's been countries such as Hungary and Turkey, where we saw a lot of similar processes in the previous couple of years. But even before this crisis began and started these long processes, there were already preconditions of this decline of democracy. And I think two of them are really important. One of them is the mistrust in traditional political actors, so political parties. And the other one is the mistrust in the democratic institutions, democratic mechanism, primarily the mistrust in elections. And if you look at the data for Serbia that Tena and Jovana have been presenting in their policy brief, this is the country where the opposition parties are have the harshest grades, so to say. 84% of the respondents have negative opinion about their capacity or organization. And on the other hand, there's the highest percentage of respondents that thought that the government can't be changed through elections. So these are bad numbers, but they have been bad before. They have been bad in the 2000s. They've been progressively worsening over time. I think what contributed to this development has not only been like the authoritarian party winning the elections in 2018 and then consolidating its power. It's also been this confusing role of internal and external actors. And by internal, I primarily mean the social movements, which have been slowly replacing the role of traditional political actors, and the expectations of the EU as an advocate of democracy, which have been replaced by EU more or less condoning some of the practices that have been developing in the region. I mean, when we think about why this is difficult for any political actor to bring out change, it's because the authoritarian parties are, or the ruling parties are political machines that are well oiled with public resources, and replacing them with any other actor, it's basically almost impossible. So what we have are elections with predictable outcomes, right? And we have seen in a couple of cases in the Western Balkans that some of them became more competitive. And I guess the question that we might be asking tonight is, why are some elections competitive and not the others? I guess the problems are very similar, and different actors have been applying different solutions. My sense is that there has not been enough innovations of democratic practices. We can talk about them. There are a couple of really interesting examples. In Serbia, boycott of elections was an imposed strategy. It was really the strategy that you use once you're out of any other strategy. And so the results that Tena and Jovana are showing, very low support, this has been the case before the boycott and after the boycott. I mean, what authoritarian parties that are ruling the countries is basically abusing the electoral processes in a way that's different from elections being gamed in pretty much all democracies. I mean, we know that in every democracy, incumbents have advantage, but it doesn't become the determining factor of who wins the elections. And the authoritarian regimes basically use two things. They mobilize the ruling party voting base, and they passivize the opposition. And the first thing is, of course, done by clientelism and patronage as the main instruments of redistributive politics. And the second, at least in Serbia, is done by media domination. And the issue of voter intimidation, that's very often given as an example of what's wrong with the elections. I think it's not the primary thing that keeps these parties in power. And so let me just be very quick and try to answer what is the problem that we're dealing with. So governments might change, but policies tend to remain the same, because replacing the government doesn't even come close to the underlying problems. And I think the underlying problems were there before. So we speak a lot about authoritarian centralization of power, and this has been the case, at least in Serbia, in the last 7 or 8 years. But the state capture, I think it's a constant thing, and I think we should always go back to the original meaning that was proposed by Western Bank, by the World Bank, and the development economists, the propensity of big money to shape the rules of the game. So this was the way that that the economy was run in the early 2000s in Serbia when it became when Serbia was just starting its economic transition. And so this has left a huge field for the authoritarian parties to hit at these democratic practices and the parties that were in power. And so when we think about the change, we cannot limit our prescription to electoral changes, because it really matters who comes after and whether these issues will be addressed. And again, it's a very difficult issue. How do we communicate that? How do we advocate electoral changes, but also question who comes after? And so when I think about the real change, of course,
Okay, so I'm afraid that Vujo's screen has frozen, so I will take advantage of it and and stop this presentation there. We can come back to your points later. Thank you so much, Vujo, for these really excellent points, for highlighting how the systemic issues are front and center in these problems, and how the pressure on voters is not the main thing on election day, or even immediately before. How the whole environment contributes to this issue of the resistance to change. Let's now turn to Kosovo and to Donika Emini, and I'll take Vujo's excellent question and redirect it to Donika. Why are some elections competitive and not the others? Donika, tell us about Kosovo's example. Tell us about what happened in 2019 and what is about to happen now. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Tena. Thanks to BPAG, CSOGS, but also you, to both of you for this amazing paper. It's my pleasure to talk here because we are on the verge of the next snap elections, which are going to take place in less than 3 weeks. And my first, the first answer that came to my mind after reading the question of this panel discussion was that. No, because if elections brought changes in Kosovo, we would be already a consolidated, fully transformed democracy, and we would be definitely the front runners in the integration process. I mean, we have had elections every 2 years since 2014. Every political crisis triggered snap elections, but these did not necessarily, these elections, translated into real change on the ground. So every time we thought about changes in the Balkans, disentangling state capture, we always came up with the first solution, which was the change of political elite. But then even when the political elite changes, there are many challenges. And the first one being the fact that, in the past 20 years, for instance, Kosovo has been ruled by a political elite, which has been kind of spreading everywhere through clientelism. And it's very hard to disentangle all of that within a mandate. I mean, that's even, something, it's an illusion. But when you think of the case of Kosovo, I might, I'm kind of conflicted because there is some change, yes. And that change is first in procedures and Central Election Committee and the way that Kosovo learned how to, learning by doing. We have done it so often that we had to at least, learned how to organize and well administer elections at some point. The last elections in 2019 were perfectly procedure-wise. There have been like minor flaws, but all international monitoring missions have declared that the elections were well organized. The second positive element is that there is critical mass. I mean, Kosovo, as I mentioned, has been going through a lot of political crises, but the very, very diverse and dynamic opposition, which you actually state in your paper that apart from Kosovo, all the countries do not believe that the opposition is well organized. In Kosovo, it has been Bieber Vendosia, the biggest opposition party, somehow kind of helped build this critical mass, which resulted in people not voting the ruling elites anymore and kind of translate it into change in 2019 elections. So there is a critical mass, which is good, and change can come through elections, which is another good point. And apart from Montenegro, Kosovo is actually high in percentage believing that elections as a process can bring change. But the no part is the fact that the Kurti's government, which was considered the change, the reformist government, not having the KLA commanders included in the government for the first time after the war in Kosovo, lasted only 50 days. And that was because the old ruling elite used all the mechanisms that they have built in the past 20 years against, a government in the beginning of the pandemic. And, this is the best case that reflects the fact that the change can happen, but then disentangling all that has happened in the past 20 years is very hard and requires a lot of multi-frontal engagement, which unfortunately Kosovo did not have back in 2020. If you look at 2020, Kosovo has changed 3 governments. The caretaker government, we started the year with the caretaker government Haradinaj, and then went to Kurti and then Hoti's government, and now Hoti's government is caretaker, and we are waiting for the next elections. When it comes to the next elections, now being afraid of this change, the ruling elite, because now is the ruling elite with Hoti, somehow made it impossible for Kurti and his party to actually run in these elections. His list is not certified, and because of the decision of the Constitutional Court, and this would prevent not just the biggest opposition party from participating in the elections, but also a potential winner of elections, hence, preventing the change to take place in the February elections. The second point that is very relevant to mention here is the diaspora vote, which Jovana mentioned before, because in Kosovo it's a game changer. Diaspora is quite big, dynamic, and vibrant, and they are actively participating in the political and public life in Kosovo. The last elections, they had the possibility to travel, so all the fuss that exists in relation to the procedures, they kind of avoided by traveling back home. But this year, due to COVID-19 pandemic, this is almost impossible. The Central Election Committee kind of made it very complex and complicated, and the process of verifying the voters coming from outside is taking longer than it should. So failing to verify them would, in a way, harm Vetvendosie, because the trend of diaspora now is mostly pro-Vetvendosie. So this is being believed as another tool that the ruling parties are using against, the potential change in Kosovo. So now we are standing, like, we don't know which are the parties that are going to run, and then how the elections results are going to look like. At the time being, Kosovo does not have a president. We only have an acting president, an acting prime minister, and we have no functioning parliament. So we are on the verge of one of what is known as biggest political, institutional, and constitutional crisis without, the heads of state. Thinking of change, there is one question that I want to conclude my intervention with: is who is going to replace the old elite? Is the new elite going to be the same? I mean, this is a question that is, kind of tormenting us here in Kosovo, because there have been many decisions that even the Kurti government, but also the way that the acting president, being part of Kurti's list, has somehow used her position to intervene and interfere in Central Election Committee's work, kind of makes us think that even for them, the law and rule of law is flexible. Doing it in the name of change, they are using the same mechanisms that the old ruling elite has been using in Kosovo to capture the state. So are we changing the elite? Are we changing the capturer? Are we going to waste another 20 years until we realize, as a full policy cycle, like as long as it took for us to realize that Thaci and co are harming Kosovo? Will it take us another 20 years to realize that, you know, we are just changing the capturer, but not actually moving forward in the process of transformation? This is a question that remains to be answered. I mean, we have still a lot of reserves, but this is not the case with the citizens. Citizens are willing to take anything that is not the ruling party. They do not care at this point about the programs. They do not care about ideologies. They see the mixes of lefts and rights in one party, and they don't really, you know, talk about that. All they want is change, and all they want is the current political parties that have led the country in the past 20 years out of the government. How this is going to work afterwards, and how Kurd is going to use, if he comes to power, all this support that he has by the citizens, remains to be seen. We will probably have another panel discussion soon and discuss about how the post-COVID-19 Western Balkans will look like. So this is for my initial intervention, and I remain open to answering your questions, not just in relation to my intervention, but also the expectations of the elections in Kosovo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donika, for this fascinating window into the ins and outs of Kosovan politics, and on this really timely and important question of if we change the captures, if we change the actors, do the practices remain the same? So this is really something that I've been grasping a lot with in my scholarship, in my research, and something that the other panelists might also want to reflect on. How do we change the norms? Is it enough to change the people? How do we get the norms to change? So let me just remind our distinguished audience to start posting their questions if they have any. They can use the Q&A function. Please don't be shy and write your questions there as we're approaching the Q&A session. But before that, we still have two panelists, and now we move on to Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have here with us Borisa Falatar, who was a candidate on behalf of Naša Stranka in 2018, and he was defined by the international press as an excellent candidate at the wrong elections. So in spite of his impressive international career and his CV that you will see soon on the chat that Julie will no doubt post, he really has an incredible background of both academic and in terms of work, and he ran as a candidate for the tripartite presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, so this three-member body which collectively serves as the head of state of Bosnia and Herzegovina back in 2018. As he will explain, the chances of success were very little since the start for him, and yet his party, also on the wings of his campaign, managed to increase the number of votes fourfold that time. So there was, to a certain extent, an interesting outcome. And what really impressed me is and interested me is his mode of campaigning. So he decided, as he told me, instead of going around and pontificating to the people during his campaign, he decided to make a listening campaign, to tour the country and really listen to the problems of the people. So Borisa, what were the obstacles you found yourself up against when running for elections, and to which degree have you been able to overcome them? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tena, for this great introduction. It's a real pleasure to be among this panel. I'm also delighted to see the diversity of participants, and I see some familiar names. Special greeting to Adi Jarimagic and others that I recognize among the list of participants. So let me start with a kind of introduction on some of the obstacles that aspiring politicians are facing in Bosnia. Now, Jovana talked about the pressure on voters. Vujo talked about incumbents having advantage, but the particular situation of Bosnia is that it has probably the world's most complex complicated system of government. Now we're a nation of 3 million people, and yet we're governed by 3 presidents, by 14 prime ministers, by around 180 appointed ministers, and more than 700 lawmakers, which are in 14 different parliaments. In the previous general elections, there were 65 registered parties, 24 independent candidates, and more than 20 coalitions. So everyone is running at the same time. It's the general election where you have parliamentary elections for all 14 parliaments, as well as presidential elections. Now you have this cacophony of candidates and different political options. When you go to vote in Bosnia, you're presented with a voting sheet as thick as probably 1980s phone book of a large city. So when there's such a complicated political process, all focus shifts to the top, to the elections of the presidents. And in Bosnia is particular because we only have 1 round of elections, and we are electing 3 members of the presidency at the same time. Now, when this happens, I was, throughout my campaign, I was reminded of a prisoner's dilemma, which is a model in game theory, economic theory, which talks about how rational people make irrational choices in certain situations. Now, in politics and in economics, we assume that voters and economic actors are rational human beings. When they presented with choice, that they would have self-interest in mind, and that they will make choice that is serves their interests well, that is the most beneficial for them. Now, what game theory shows is that economic actors and political actors never take decisions in isolation. They are always taking decisions in situation of interdependence. So my decision has impact and affects not only my well-being, but also the well-being of others. Now, what game theory shows is that normally in such situations, even rational people take decisions that are irrational and run counter to their self-interest. Now, in Bosnia, in practice, this plays out as follows: people are presented with a choice of, let's say, 5 candidates for their own representative in the presidency. But at the same time, they look at what other people's choices are. So if you have 15 candidates for presidency, 5 Bosniak, 5 for Croat, 5 for Serb, what people will think about not only who are my candidates, who are the best candidates from my nationality, but also who may be the candidate that other people choose. And if there is only one candidate that might be a little bit more nationalistic and more extreme, then people will start thinking, well, why would I choose a moderate when the other side may go with a very extreme guy or candidate? And in practice, this means that it's very easy to have people take choices and go for somebody who is more nationalistic and may not be the best for them. This is why I think it's one of the obstacles, because in Bosnia people have only one choice. They can only make one choice every 4 years. In other countries, presidential elections have 2 rounds of voting. So when you make a choice in Bosnia, voters take a risk because they know that if they don't choose a candidate who is electable or deemed electable, their choice is thrown away. So I think this is one of the reasons why there's the choices that people make are very often lead to same results. And when you look at the results over the past 30 years in Bosnia, and 30 years is a really long time, they're remarkably stable. SDA has always had between 20 and 25% of the vote, HDZ between 12 and 15, and the situation is similar in Republika Srpska. At the same time, if you're running for office, you also take a risk, because you know that there's very little chance of succeeding. And so when you're a big political party, you can take this risk, because you know that you will have enough people in the parliament to ensure that the person running for president who is deemed to lose will probably can be elected in the House of People, so in the upper house of parliament. But if you're a small aspiring party who wants to present a presidential candidate, there you are running a risk of this person then losing and exposing him or herself, and then losing and not having a political future for the next 4 years. So there's risk that political candidates take, and there's risk that other people take. So I'm mindful of the time. I want to go on. Tena, can I go on a little bit longer, or should I leave it for Q&A?
So Borisa, tell us what you heard during your listening campaign. I'm really curious about that, and what you think worked. Is there anything positive that you would highlight from that experience of yours?
I can highlight only positive things. And I wanted to say that despite all the obstacles, and there are many more than I have mentioned, I believe that the question is, can elections bring real change? I think that only elections can bring change. We have to realize that. And then what I have found out is that people are so used to being just, after 30 years of sane people in power, they have become incredibly lazy, not taking the time to develop, any policies, not taking the time to get close to the people, not taking the time to really listen and innovate. And I had a feeling that our campaign was so groundbreaking. It brought so many new ideas just because we decided to listen to the people and demystify politics, because I strongly believe that public service is the noblest of professions, and so many people see it as the worst thing that one can do, especially in Western Balkans. So what we try to do is first of all to demystify, what is it being a candidate, be very open about our campaign, to really listen to people, and what I've realized is that it's much easier to talk about policies that you want to implement, to talk about some of the challenges that the country is meeting, if you understand how it affects real people. So rather than saying, over the past 4 years, 150,000 people, 5% of our population has left the country, it's much easier to explain to people why this is so bad. When you meet, a young woman who and see her child, and she tells you, he's playing alone because everyone else is gone to Germany. So I think that there's so much space for new ideas, for new kinds of politics, and I'd really like to encourage people to get involved as much as they can, because elections can only elections can bring real change in the Western Balkans.
Thank you so much, Borisa. That was most inspiring. We can see that from the amount of excellent questions that have been pouring in while you have been speaking. So I'll take advantage of our next speaker, who needs no introductions, I reckon, Professor Florian Bieber, to ask him already one of the questions that have popped up about boycotts. So we have Stefan Swed, who asks, who highlights the fact that in context of extreme backsliding or state capture, the boycott might actually be the only way, and in some cases, as he says, it has actually been successful. So, Florian, can you tell us a bit more about boycotts and about the conditions in which they can bring to some change or not, and tell us about what does it mean to have fair enough elections? What does it mean to get to a fair enough level playing field? The floor is yours.
Thanks, Tena. And I think, I mean, the excellent presentations before we make it easier and harder to speak to the panel. I mean, I would first like to say, I mean, it's Vujo has said it very clearly. Of course, elections are never enough by themselves. And there's always a risk if there's structural elements of democratic deficiency that they're reproduced after the elections. And I mean, Montenegro might become there are certain negative or warning signs which we have to observe carefully, which suggest that. And even in Macedonia, North Macedonia, which has certainly seen a dramatic transformation after the changes, it's not everything easy. So, I mean, there are structural problems which are not connected to individuals or individual parties. But I think, the key point is without elections, none of this will happen. Because if you don't assume, and this is what Borisa was saying, if you don't have elections, if you don't have change through elections, the only other alternative is either no change, or you have revolution, or you have only change within ruling parties. And, I think if you're committed to democracies, these are not desirable scenarios. Now, drawing on the findings which Jovana has presented, I mean, it indeed seems to be the case that boycotts are often not well seen, especially in the cases where in the case of Serbia, the most recent example. Now, I don't think this is, of course, that boycotts are generally undesirable, but they have problems, of course, because at the end of the day, boycotts, they delay a process, right? They delay the ability to challenge a government through elections. So they push down a certain step down in a certain way on a time horizon, where it might be the decision, it might be a good decision at that particular juncture, but it's a high price because, again, it pushes it gives the government additional power for a certain number of years. It also, of course, makes it harder to challenge the government through the institutions. It locks yourself out of institutions. And I think, Tena, as you were saying, is that there are two different types of elections. Implying there's the election boycott, which we've seen in Serbia, and then there's the institutional boycott, which we've had in Montenegro, which we've had in North Macedonia, and that's quite different because it's reversible. Election boycotts are irreversible because you don't set the terms for the next elections. So in that sense, it's a one-way ticket out of the institutions. Now, it might have been the right choice of the Serbian opposition because of its limited capacity at that moment. And it's not just about electoral terms, but it's also about opposition capacity one has to look at. Because, of course, we can say the elections in Serbia last year were not free and fair by any standard. And neither are the elections in Belarus, which are much further away from being free and fair by any standard. And still the opposition candidates participated and by all accounts won. So the question is, when are conditions fair enough? The elections in Serbia in 2000, which Koštunica won, were not free and fair elections by any stretch of the imagination. But the opposition decided to compete because, again, incumbents are not likely to allow fully free and fair elections if they have any resources to control. So how do free and fair elections in competitive authoritarian regimes come about? Well, they never come about perfectly. Because the only way they would come about if there's a strong pressure from below through citizens' movements, or if there's external pressure from the European Union or other actors. But and I think we see this kind of also in the survey that a lot of this pressure which is happening, it's never happening in election days. External pressure is very hard to be successful in ensuring free and fair elections. And the other issue is a lot of it is invisible. I mean, even, this is the paradox of the survey. It suggests that lots of citizens believe there's political pressure on elections, but very few have experienced it themselves. Now, you can interpret it, meaning that actually it doesn't happen that much. or you can interpret it saying it's so invisible. It's not that citizens actually consider it to be election pressure, but they are so in a certain way caught up in the system that it's not about specific election pressure, but they know their job or their fathers or their wives or their husband's job is tied up with the ruling party. So the party doesn't have to remind you that you should vote for the right person. So in that sense, I think this kind of network is very strong. So this is very hard to break. So I think the question is not when are elections free and fair, it's like when are they free and fair enough for a competitive environment. And Montenegro is a good example. I mean, the elections in August last year were not better than previous elections. It's just that the opposition was better organized, not great organized by any account, and that the government made strategic error in the issue which mobilized citizens to go out and vote. And I think this is the other thing which we see in the survey is that people are actually not sick and tired of going to vote. I mean, in fact, they're quite eager to participate. And election results turnout numbers are actually surprisingly high if you take away what Borisa was saying, the high number of people who are abroad and who either cannot or won't participate in elections. So in fact, of those who are back home, a lot more participate in elections than you would expect considering the circumstances. And again, these are resources one can tap into. So the question is really, what is free? When are the elections competitive enough? And I think this is maybe the better term, competitive enough rather than free and fair enough that there's a chance. And again, I think one has to also distinguish different levels. So if you look at cases where there's been successful efforts of opposition to challenge entrenched regimes in Turkey and in Hungary, this happened first at the local level, in Budapest and cities, or in Istanbul and Ankara, because of course, first of all, it breaks the spell of invincibility, but it also allows opposition parties to gain experience and also claim that they have the ability to rule, because also many of these incumbents have a technocratic argument for staying in power. They're saying we're the only ones who are competent, and the opposition is disorganized, incompetent, and can't rule the country. I mean, this was the argument in Montenegro, and the opposition is sometimes proving them right. And this has been the argument in Turkey. And if you are able to rule a municipality, you are able to also challenge it. And again, reminding us of Serbia 2000, without the winning of the opposition in municipalities across the country in 1997, and its challenge to the attempts to falsify the results, there would have not been the victory for the opposition in DOS in 2000, because they had the local media, they had local resources and local mayors who were all campaigning, and that helped them. So I think one has to really, in a certain way, say about what are the conditions and what do oppositions need to do to really participate, rather than hoping for free and fair conditions, which I think are unlikely, and no external actor is going to be successfully able to bring them about.
Thank you so much, Florian.